Hello and welcome aboard, cadets. Today we'll be doing another Battletech lore video. This will be a rough overview of the Periphery states as well as history of how the Periphery states came to be the way they are in 3025. So firstly, we need to discuss where and when the Periphery started. And this is the part where I tell you the lore is wrong and I'm right. As outlandish as that may sound, at first, bear with me just a moment here. So the lore states explicitly that the Periphery didn't come about until the Outer Reach Rebellion in 2230, and where colonial planets rebelled against the Terran Alliance. In this conflict, the Terran Alliance, facing further colonial discontent throughout its colonial empire, would withdraw its military forces into a more defensive-like position. Anything within 30 light years of Terra would remain under Terran Alliance, and the near countless colonies spanning 500 fucking light years in diameter were granted independence, whether the poor sobs are ready for it or not. Now, supposedly, this is the point in which the Periphery was born. However, in some sources and in older lore, it refers to the early Terran Western Alliance, which was originally the major Western powers who initially kicked off the mass colonization. However, during this period, due to the sheer speed in which colonization took place, it was not unheard of for new colonies to occasionally be discovered. And later, in which the newly reformed Terran Alliance would send out survey corps fleets to discover lost colonies. Now, in this circumstances, most of these colonies on the fringes of the ever-growing sphere operated or are suggested to have operated independently, meaning the Periphery did in fact exist during the mass colonization period. I need to be honest with you fellas, the lore and even the source books for Battletech are often contradicting each other. The reason for this is intentional, for you see, every source book, lore book, hell, even fucking technical readouts are biased. The reason for this is every book, save for the rule sections of the tabletop books, is written from the perspective of different time periods and of different people within the Battletech universe. So, for a quick example, let's say we read the House Kirita source book, and they will of course say stuff such as the Dragon Mech is most honorable senpai, hi, or the Lyran Commonwealth are Bakas, and they have false claims on our most righteous land, as well as they are suppressing combined people and populaces on contested worlds. They will always view themselves in a justifiable sense as the more righteous successor state, with the strongest claim to first lordship. So you can kinda see that all the books will always be biased, and will always tell you, for the most part, facts as they see them, which is why reading another source book on the same conflict from a different faction, such as Comstar or the Lyrian Commonwealth, will give you a different outlook entirely, as well as reveal new details you didn't know that had happened. But then you gotta ask yourself, who do you truly believe? Who is righteous? Who is villainous? Good or evil? Or are none of them? And that, my friends, is what makes Battletech a very interesting universe that you can sort of just delve into, and you can kind of pick who you like and who you don't. Or, do you not like all of them, or do you like some of them? It's up to you entirely. Now try to always bear that in mind as we go into any factional lore that is more so opinion than anything. Now, with that minor point out of the way, there is one thing we need to discuss further before talking about the Periphery. That is proper sphere orientation. Much like planetary compasses, directions of north, east, south, and west, the sphere has its compass as well, to help put direction to an otherwise directionless space. For this instance, when looking at any map, much like a map of our own world, north is coreward, east is spinward, south is rimward, and west would be anti-spinward. For the sake of the Periphery, due to it existing on the rim of the sphere, we will break them down by these four directions, as to not get confused as to where we are, especially considering we're talking about an approximate 500 light-year diameter in some places. Well, the Periphery has always been fiercely independent, dating as far back as the outreach rebellions of the colonial empire of the Terran Alliance. Now, while not always at conflict with inner sphere states, the Periphery, for the most part, would remain largely unmolested after the outreach rebellions. This would allow for the Periphery states to grow vast nation-states from nothing. A primary example of this would be the Coreward Rimworld's Republic and the Rimward Taurian Concordat, seeing vast colonial growth throughout the era. However, this would not last forever. And despite the Age of War, which all the while ravished the mighty empires of the Inner Sphere, the rise of the Star League would see the beginning of an era of peace throughout the Inner Sphere, which the souls who had fled to the Periphery to escape the bloodshed would find themselves directly in the crosshairs of not only the Star League, but of all the major houses now comfortably resided within it. During this period, House Cameron would begin major propaganda campaigns, painting the Periphery states in two distinct lights, the first light of which painted them as lost souls of mankind who suffered from famine, disease, and war. The second light was that they were also barbarians at the gate who've lost the light of mankind and threatened civilization itself. The Camerons, who are masters of romanticization and persuasion, found populaces of the sphere in wanderlust of mysterious Periphery states, much like how we view the old Wild West today. Dangerous and lawless, hence the less than flattering Periphery bandit kingdoms. Now, House Cameron, currently under Ian Cameron, would adopt two tactics. Firstly, they would offer the Periphery the carrot approach: membership, protection, aid, and supplies to help the fledgling states and open arms as brothers and sisters of mankind. Now, all save for one of the four major Periphery states accepted the offer, while the remaining three told them to politely fuck off. The Wormworld's Republic, hedging its bets as always, presumably having a good feeling that the Terran hegemony, Director General Mr. Cameron, doesn't take no for an answer. Hegemony propaganda at this point, even before the big ol' FU reached Terra, had been ratcheting up. The propaganda to as either redemption-based, lost children of Mother Terra, or destruction, thugs, villains, and barbarians with no morals. It was as everyone feared in the Periphery: either join or be forced to join. There would be no live and let live this day. The Star League, or I should say fledgling Star League, would crank the carrot approach up another notch by calling for a galactic summit for the major states, inviting the Periphery to attend. As you would expect, only our boy Gregory Amaris from the Wormworld's Republic bothered to show up at Terra. My money's on he was there for the free Terran cheesecake. However, it did not take long for insult to turn to outrage. Soon, the Outworld Alliance would purchase several companies of light mechs in order to shore up her defenses against growing pirate raids, backed by Inner-Sphere states attempting to pressure the Periphery power to seek aid from the Star League, which, mind you, by the time the word of the purchase reached Terra, all the while passing from relay to relay, the light companies would become state-of-the-art assault lances, capable of taking some serious and dishing out some serious firepower. And when this news finally reached our lad Ian Cameron, he felt a sudden urge to act, fearing that the Periphery states of the Outworld Alliance was arming, perhaps in defense or worse, against the Star League, would set a precedent to the many major and minor Periphery states not yet aligned to the Star League. His action would see Inner-Sphere troops entering Outworld space and planets under the pretext of mutual defense. Unfortunately, the Outworlds was quick to realize that these troops were garrisoning core and strategic worlds within the Outworlds Alliance. While many Periphery states across the very sphere would cry out in outrage at the violation of a fellow Periphery sovereignty, there was little they could do to aid the Outworlds. Ian Cameron, along with the current reigning coordinator of the Draconis Combine, Hero Karita, would begin searching for these mechs, rather forcefully, might I add. As resentment to occupation grew, it was only a matter of time until a spark would help ignite the flames of discontent and rebellion. That spark came in an incident known as the Santiago Massacre, in where children, whom of which throwing snowballs at armed SLDF as well as Inner-Sphere troops resulted in an escalation of violence. I will quote the following as an example. Quote, "Sick and tired of taunting school children lobbing snowballs at you? Lob coolant fluid right back at them. And if one of the kiddies takes a freeze burn to the eyeballs from the Freon, well, that'll teach the brats to defy the Star League's authority. Then, when the screaming child attracts an angry crowd, fire everything you've got at them, because you never know what a ragtag mob of Periphery lowlifes might do, armed with snow and sticks and clods of frozen dirt. Plus, anyone you injure or kill will serve as an object lesson against future defiance of your superior firepower. And heck, you can always claim later that you just panicked. Wouldn't anyone, faced with a screaming horde of savages? From the way it is, Gentle Annie, Sawaski's personal journal, Aferetz, Outworld Alliance, 9th January 2573. End quote. The news feeds would be jammed-packed for days of children clutching their mothers in agony and pain, a woman half-charred from a laser strike, a Cretan mech whose pilot had claimed to stumble over a car, accidentally crushing dozens of the angry crowd. When the Outworlds were denied to try her for the crime, and instead she was sent to be court-martialed on Terra, 'twas the final straw that broke this camel's back. Despite this, and despite what most would have presumed to be Cameron's next course of action, to use this as justification to fully occupy the Outworlds Alliance, his response was instead a shock to both the Periphery and Inner Sphere states. He instead ordered Star League forces to stay within their garrisons and attempted to cool rising tensions to the best of his abilities. Now, some would argue that perhaps Ian was genuine in his attempts to aid the Periphery state, while others would see this as Ian attempting to ready his forces to take on the Periphery instead. Despite these attempts to soothe rising tensions, the Canopian magistrates broke negotiations with the Free Worlds League. As well, the Taurian Concordat began rapidly building up a Sudeten line-like defense against the Federated Sun's border. The Star League would begin to appeal desperately to the Taurians by extending the most nation-favored trade status offer continuously throughout the year. The Taurians would continue to reject the offer repeatedly. As tensions continued to rise yet further, Taurian naval vessels incidentally jumped into the Malgarota system, sending alarm through a Davian mining colony. This incident would become known as the Garota Crisis. Ian Cameron would side with the Federated Suns, demanding the Taurians compensate the Federated Suns for the border violation. Diplomats would cease their efforts after the Taurian Concordat's current protector, Mitchell Calderon, replied, "Go home, sir. We are not ignorant primitives willing to sell our planets for mirrors and glass beads. We are a free people, and we intend to stay that way." And on the other side of the sphere, the Rimworld's Republic populace would riot in outrage of the SLDF massacre. However, the ruling family, House Amaris, would put these riots down, choosing to stay loyal to their Star League allies. Well, for now. The years of rising tension led to a final breaking point, Ian Cameron's infamous Pollux Proclamation, in which the Periphery could not be trusted to rule themselves and instead must submit to the Star League. The many trade sanctions and outrageous tariffs imposed upon the many Periphery nations had failed to bring them to heel. The only option left to unify mankind and achieve House Cameron's greatest vision of a unified mankind was war. The many Periphery nations had very little in the way of industrial capacity, save for the Taurian Concordat, to replace mechs and vehicles as well as maintain their armies. Most Periphery miners were able to muster modified agromechs for combat alongside their pitiful low-tech armies. Even the Outworlds Alliance had no more than 120 light battle mechs. Things indeed looked grim. As it would also seem, the Rimworld's Republic would not come to the aid of the many major and minor Periphery nations. Even the Rimworld's Republic would take a drastic turn. While the Star League prepared her armies towards the borders of the Periphery, the trade deals which had brought the nobles and the ruling class as well as House Amaris profit were also the very same trade deals that saw the largest taxation of the middle and lower classes. Coupled with Gregory Amaris' iron grip over his nation, it would finally spark into open rebellion and civil war. Gregory did two things to spark this conflict. The first was cementing his alliance with the Star League by praising Ian Cameron's Pollux Proclamation as the first among equals, and finally by passing the Manchester Edict, which outlawed membership to the Rim Republican Army. Rebellion would sweep across the Republic. Even Gregory Amaris' royal forces would refuse to fire upon rebellious populace and RRA forces. Instead, they would side with the new provisional government, and Gregory would flee to his private estate, hiding behind his vast fortifications. His allies in the Star League would not come to his aid either, for they were tied up in stiff resistance from other major Periphery states. Aid would not come from the League until 2581, nearly 6 years after the provisional government takeover. What would come during this would be known as the Reunification Wars, which is 4 massive campaigns rolled up into one big bundle of autism. In the Outworlds Alliance, SLDF and Inner Sphere forces under the command of General Amos Forlo would see some rather stiff resistance from the pacifistic populaces of the Outer Worlds. This would be due to the General's lapse in judgment to meet any form of resistance with decimation of entire planetary populations. Executing 1 of every 10 adults, militia recruitment from this action would soar, and the general would become known as the Butcher. Despite 1 in 10 adults slaughtered, the Butcher's troops sparked such an outrage that the war fervor had turned the Outer Worlds Alliance into a fierce and bloody hellscape of war, instead of the quick, decisive surrender he had originally hoped for. Resistance in the Outworlds would gain further traction as the youngest son of the Federated Sun's current ruling prince, Alexander, would send military aid to the Outworlds Alliance. Having been denied previously, requested aid from the League for the Federated Sun's suffering economy. For this aid, President of the Outworlds Alliance offered 12 agricultural-rich border worlds to enter under House Davian protectorship, and as a result of this humble offer, the young Davian agreed to send 3 elite regiments to aid in the defense of the Outworlds against General Forlot. With the new support of the elite Davian regiments, Outworld forces were able to buy an additional 3 years until General Forlot the Butcherer was replaced and reinforced, to which when they surrendered, they were treated as an equal at the bargaining table, for what little that was worth at the time. On the other side of the spectrum, when the Alliance Army forces successfully ambushed Forlot, beating his army back in what would become known locally as the Day of Vengeance, where SLDF had lost over 200 battle mechs, it only helped to gain the SLDF further support from Inner Sphere populaces, seeing the battle as proof that the hordes of barbarians needed to be put back in their place, and be guided by the light of civilization, which of course would be the Inner Sphere powers. Not quite grasping that the Periphery was indeed actually fighting for its very liberty and right for self-governance. This would completely trash the Periphery's only hope for victory, which was to prolong the war and make it so costly that the Inner Sphere populace would lose all faith in supporting its war effort. This fundamental lack of understanding in both thinking as well as how deeply rooted the major house powers were would help lead to the downfall of the Periphery's liberty. Inner Sphere propaganda had sold the dwellers of the Inner Sphere that the reunification was not just a war of ideals of the League, but essential that mankind be unified once more under a single major banner. This failing of both parties would create the great cultural schism of spheroids and Periphery dwellers that can be felt hundreds of years later to this day. The Periphery denizens feeling betrayed by their spheroid cousins who were too arrogant to care about the massacres and mass losses of life and hardships forced upon the Periphery populace, while the spheroids believed that they should be grateful, despite being dragged kicking and squealing into the now fully unified Star League in 2596. From this point onwards, commonalities between Sphere and Periphery would drift further and further apart. Now this concludes our brief introduction to the Periphery states and their sort of setup. The next section, which is going to be the much larger section, will be not only the rebuilding of the Periphery states, but as well as the Ameris Civil War and its repercussions on not the Star League, but the Periphery, and what that meant for the Periphery. It sort of set the stage on how the Periphery would kind of be forever at this point onwards. Now, the Succession Wars would see some minor changes here and there, but honestly, after the Ameris Civil War and the annexation of the Rimworld's Republic and the collapse of the Star League, it kind of sets the entire stage. So we want to nail that down pretty well, and I think that's deserving of its own video, which is why I segmented this off into its own little thing, and that's why we're going to do that. And that will be coming this Saturday, so we'll be diving into that, and we'll have a lot more action, if you will. I mean, we did have some action. We had the Reunification Wars in this one, but honestly, the Reunification Wars doesn't have a whole heck of a lot because the militaries of the Periphery states at this time period were minuscule at best. I mean, some being, fielding maybe 200 mechs, and the most staunch resistance was the Astrian Conclave, and even that was rather laughable. It was only a matter of time till they capitulated. Excuse me. But yeah, they were doomed from the get-go. And the Ameris Civil War, on the other hand, things will see a drastic change in terms of military buildup and its conflict as a whole, as well as we'll even talk briefly about the liberation of the Terran hegemony. But not too much, because that's, again, another thing that's going to be deserving of its own series, the liberation of Terra and the Terran hegemony, as well as the Star League perspective. Again, we're going to try to tell this from the Periphery's perspective for the most part, but I'm going to keep trying to throw in a little bit of the spheroids as well as, the Star League's perspective on the whole situation, because it is important that you get a little bit of flavor from both perspectives, I think. The source book doesn't really talk too much about the other side's opinions, so I'll be using multiple source books to sort of compile this together. You'll have to let me know how that sort of feels. And yeah, if you didn't notice, there's some weird edits here, and for some reason it felt a little different, and that has to do with the fact that we lost half this video a little while ago, which is kind of a friggin' shame, because when my computer decided to update, thank you Windows 10, it destroyed about half of the stuff for this video. So I ended up having to scrap 90% of it and redo it, and I just wanted to get this part out to you, and I in fact ended up cutting about half of it, because I felt like I should expand upon the Ameris Civil War as well as rebuilding sections, and membership in the League, and how that impacted the Periphery states, because that kind of molded them into what they became. And I think that's very important that you guys sort of get a feel for that, because this just sort of shows the cultural buildup. How we have the spheroids with their sort of like loyalty to the houses and things like that, and their sort of like common ways. And then you got the Periphery, which they have their independence, their liberty. There's obviously some monarchies out there, but they are very independent. They don't. And also, when it comes to spheroid and Periphery relations, things are going to be sour, and they'll always have a little bit of taint from this particular conflict of the Reunification Wars. And like I said earlier, hundreds of years later, it's going to be an impact for quite a while. Also, let me know how you feel when I am, because this, for example, this last section right here, this little segment, is completely off bullet point. This is freebirding it. And again, I want to ask you guys this, because I'm going to, remake the last segment, because it deserves to be remade bigger and better. But yeah, let me know if you like the sort of free wind talking, or do you like it more bullet point based, where I have a bullet point, for example, and I go like, all right, this event, and then I just start talking about it in a very constructed manner, and then I edit it together, obviously. In this sense, we have a more natural flow, and I honestly am leaning towards the natural flow, but I kind of want some feedback and some criticism on what you guys thought about this. And if you guys could do that, relatively, I know it's kind of late notice, but quickly, before we get up to the Saturday's fucking Periphery lore video, or the part 2, the final part. And then we will do one other thing. We're going to talk about all the Periphery factions, and we're going to break it down into 4 segments under that, which will be pretty simple. It'll be the 4 basic directions, like spinward, rimward, etc., anti-spinward, the like. And we'll talk about each factions in each groups, as well as time periods and events, peoples and places. And I figured that breaking it down that way will help sort of make distinct locations. And if you guys like that, we will continue to do that for the sphere, because the inner sphere is going to be kind of the same way for the most part. We'll probably start maybe anti-spinward, possibly, and work our way all the way up to, coreward, where the Rimworld's Republic is, because I feel like that's a great place to end it, in my opinion. But yeah, so let me know what you guys' thoughts are before we proceed here, and thanks for watching. I hope you guys have a fantastic day, and until next time, this is your host, Captain Gibbs, signing off.